It was October 12, 2018, a cool Friday night in Sonoma Valley, California, where vineyards stretched endlessly, and the air carried the faint scent of crushed grapes. The sprawling property Emily shared with her husband, Paul, was tucked on the edge of town, surrounded by rows of olive trees and the kind of serenity Margaret had hoped would finally give her peace. When she moved into the guest house earlier that year, she'd believed this was her chance to heal after her husband's passing. But tonight would shatter every illusion of tranquility she'd built. The night began innocently enough. Emily had left that morning for a 3-day conference in Seattle, rushing out the door with a suitcase in one hand and a travel mug in the other. "Call me if you need anything," she'd said, kissing Paul on the cheek. Margaret had smiled and waved, already planning to keep a low profile while Emily was gone. But by 7 p.m., the low hum of loneliness had settled in. Margaret was halfway through a glass of wine on her porch when Paul's voice startled her. "Dinner plans?" he asked, leaning on the wooden railing, his shirt untucked and sleeves rolled up. Margaret shook her head. "Not really. You?" Paul smiled, a touch sheepishly. "I was just going to microwave something, but if you're up for it, we could eat together." She hesitated, unsure, but the quiet around the house was already unbearable, and his tone carried an unspoken plea. "All right," she agreed. "I'll cook." Inside the guest house, they moved in easy rhythm, Margaret stirring pasta, Paul grating Parmesan cheese. The small space made their proximity unavoidable, but Margaret ignored the occasional brush of shoulders, attributing it to clumsiness in the tiny kitchen. When they sat to eat, the conversation flowed effortlessly at first. Work updates, the weather, Emily's overpacked schedule. But as the wine bottle emptied, the mood shifted. Paul leaned back in his chair, staring at his glass. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" he asked, his voice heavy. Margaret tilted her head, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Paul exhaled sharply. "Emily's always so busy. I mean, I'm proud of her. She's brilliant. But some days it feels like I'm just part of the routine. You know?" Margaret nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "Marriage can be complicated," she said carefully. Paul looked up at her, his expression raw. "You understand. After everything you've been through, you get it. I don't think you're the only one who really listens," he interrupted, his voice dropping. "With Emily, it's always about the next project, the next big goal. I don't blame her, but I miss feeling seen." The words hung in the air, heavier than the stillness that surrounded them. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest as she tried to decipher the undercurrent of his tone. She told herself it was nothing more than a vulnerable moment, a husband venting about his wife. But then he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The touch was light but electric, sending a shock through her system. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Paul," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, his gaze locked on hers. "You deserve to feel alive, Margaret. Just like I do." She pulled her hand away, her mind racing. I think we've both had too much wine," she stammered, rising abruptly to clear the dishes. Paul followed her into the kitchen, his presence close behind. "It's not just the wine," he said quietly. "You feel it too, don't you?" Margaret spun around, panic flaring in her chest. "Paul, this isn't—" The sound of the front door slamming cut her off. Margaret's head whipped toward the noise, her stomach dropping as Emily's voice echoed through the guest house. "Mom? Paul? What's going on?" Emily stood in the doorway, her suitcase still in hand, her eyes darting between them. Margaret realized too late that Paul had stepped closer, his hand still resting on the counter where hers had been moments before. The tableau was damning. "Emily," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "I thought you weren't back until Sunday." Emily frowned, her gaze narrowing. "My last meeting was canceled. What are you two doing?" "We were just—" Paul started, but Emily cut him off. "Having dinner? Drinking wine? Alone in the guest house?" Her tone was sharp, the accusation clear. Margaret's heart pounded as Emily's eyes locked onto hers. A storm of suspicion and hurt brewing. The silence between the three of them stretched unbearably. "I think I need some air," Emily said suddenly, her voice brittle. She turned and walked out before either of them could respond. As the door closed behind her, Margaret looked at Paul, her stomach twisting with a mix of fear and guilt. "What have we done?" she whispered. Paul said nothing, his expression unreadable as he stared after his wife. But Margaret knew in that moment that the fragile balance of their lives had shifted irreparably. And whatever came next, there was no going back. Margaret stared at the closed door, Emily's voice still ringing in her ears. The cold air of the kitchen felt stifling, as though the room itself were closing in on her. She turned to Paul, searching for some semblance of reassurance. But his expression was unreadable, his silence unnerving. "We have to fix this," Margaret said, her voice low and shaky. Paul ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched. "Fix what?" "Nothing happened." "That's not how it looked to her," Margaret snapped, her nerves fraying. "You think she didn't notice the way you were standing so close? The wine? The mood? Paul, she's not stupid." Paul exhaled sharply, leaning against the counter. "Then what do you suggest we do? Tell her some fabricated story?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of a car engine revving outside made her pause. She hurried to the window, her heart sinking as she watched Emily's car pull out of the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "She's leaving," Margaret whispered. Paul joined her at the window, his brow furrowing. Where would she go at this hour? Margaret turned to him, panic rising in her chest. To clear her head? To a hotel? Or worse, to someone else who'll listen to her side of the story before we have a chance to explain. Paul cursed under his breath and grabbed his phone. "I'll call her." "No," Margaret said quickly, grabbing his arm. "Give her space. If you call her now, it'll only make things worse." Paul hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. Finally, he let out a frustrated sigh and set the phone down. "Fine, but we can't just sit here doing nothing." Margaret sank into a chair, her thoughts racing. "Maybe this will blow over," she said, though she didn't believe it. Paul shot her a skeptical look. "You think Emily's the type to just let this go?" Margaret shook her head, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't know what Emily had seen or suspected, but the tension in her daughter's voice had been unmistakable. Whatever she thought was happening, it was enough to send her storming out into the night. As the minutes dragged into hours, the silence in the house became unbearable. Margaret tried to distract herself by tidying up the kitchen, but her mind kept circling back to Emily. Where was she? Who was she talking to? And most terrifying of all, what was she planning to do? It was past midnight when Margaret finally heard a car pull into the driveway. Her pulse quickened as she peeked through the curtains, relief and dread washing over her at the sight of Emily stepping out of the car. "She's back," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul stood, his face tense. "What do we say to her?" "We stick to the truth," Margaret said firmly. "We had dinner. That's all." Paul didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't as confident as she was. Emily entered the house moments later, her expression unreadable. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her gaze bouncing between Margaret and Paul. "Well," she said, her voice sharp, "are you going to explain what the hell that was earlier?" Margaret stepped forward, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Emily, it wasn't what you think. Paul and I were just having dinner. That's all." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Just dinner? And I'm supposed to believe that?" "Yes," Margaret said, her tone firm. "You know me, Emily. I would never..." "Would never what?" Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "Cross a line? Betray me? Because from where I was standing, it sure didn't look innocent." Margaret faltered, her carefully rehearsed words crumbling under the weight of Emily's accusation. "Emily," Paul said, stepping in, "you're blowing this out of proportion." Emily's gaze snapped to him, her eyes blazing. Am I? Because I've been gone for less than a day, and I come home to find you and my mother cozying up over wine and candlelight. There were no candles, Margaret interjected, though she knew it was a pointless detail. Emily ignored her. Do you have any idea how this looks? Paul took a step closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Look, I get it. This situation feels complicated. But I swear to you, nothing happened. Emily crossed her arms tighter, her jaw set. And I'm just supposed to take your word for it? Yes, Paul said firmly, because it's the truth. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Emily shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. I don't know what's worse, she said, her voice trembling. The idea that something might have happened, or the fact that I can't trust either of you anymore. Emily, please, Margaret said, her voice breaking. You're my daughter. You know I would never hurt you. Emily stared at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I thought I knew that, but now, I don't know what to think. She turned abruptly and walked out of the room, leaving Margaret and Paul standing in stunned silence. Margaret sank into a chair, her hands trembling. What do we do now? Paul didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the doorway Emily had just walked through. Margaret had thought the worst was over when Emily came home. But as the hours stretched into the early morning, it became clear that the true fallout was only just beginning. The morning after Emily's late-night confrontation, the house felt heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of their unspoken words. Margaret barely slept, her mind consumed with the events of the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed Emily's expression. Hurt, anger, and worst of all, doubt. By sunrise, Emily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, furiously typing. Margaret approached cautiously, her heart in her throat. Emily? She began softly. Can we talk? Emily didn't look up. I have nothing to say right now, Mom. Margaret winced. Please just give me a chance to explain. I know how things looked last night, but I swear. Emily's fingers froze on the keyboard, and she finally looked up. How things looked? She repeated, her tone sharp. Do you think I'm an idiot? I saw the way Paul was looking at you. That wasn't just dinner, and you know it. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat. The truth was, Emily wasn't wrong. Margaret had felt the shift in Paul's demeanor, the unspoken tension between them. She told herself it was innocent, but deep down, she knew better. Before Margaret could respond, Paul entered the kitchen, his face set in a mask of calm. Morning, he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Emily's gaze snapped to him, her eyes blazing. Morning? That's all you have to say. Paul sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Emily, we've been over this. Nothing happened. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. And I'm supposed to believe that? After the way you two were acting. Margaret stepped forward, desperation clawing at her chest. Emily, please. I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe me. Emily's laugh was bitter. Believe you? When you've already crossed a line. Paul raised his hands in frustration. Enough. We're not going to get anywhere like this. Emily rounded on him, her voice trembling with fury. Don't you dare tell me how to feel. You betrayed me, Paul. Both of you did. Do you know how humiliating it is to come home and see your husband and your mother looking like that? The room fell into an unbearable silence, the tension suffocating. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Emily, Margaret said softly, I'll move out. If that's what it takes to make things right, I'll go. Emily's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, the anger in her eyes wavered, replaced by something softer, hurt, betrayal, and a trace of disbelief. Maybe you should, Emily said quietly, her voice cracking. Margaret's heart broke, but she nodded. If that's what you want. Paul stepped forward, his voice firm. No, Margaret isn't going anywhere. This is ridiculous, Emily. Nothing happened. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Emily's eyes widened, and her voice rose. Are you seriously defending her right now? You don't even see what you've done, do you? Before Paul could respond, the doorbell rang. The unexpected sound jolted them all, and Emily strode to the door, muttering under her breath. Margaret and Paul exchanged a wary glance as Emily opened the door. Standing there was a man Margaret didn't recognize. A stranger with dark hair and a guarded expression. He held a manila envelope in his hand, his gaze flicking over Emily before settling on Margaret. Mrs. Whitman? He asked, his voice neutral. Margaret frowned, stepping forward hesitantly. Yes. The man extended the envelope. You've been served. Margaret froze, her hand trembling as she took the envelope. What is this? The man didn't respond, merely nodding curtly before walking away. Margaret stared at the envelope in her hands, her mind racing. She opened it slowly, her stomach sinking as she skimmed the contents. It was a lawsuit, filed by Emily. Emily's voice broke the silence, sharp and unyielding. I've spoken to a lawyer, Mom, and I'm filing for guardianship of the guesthouse property. You won't be living here anymore. Margaret's breath caught. Emily, this isn't necessary. Emily crossed her arms, her face a mask of resolve. It is. You've overstepped every boundary. I can't trust you anymore. Paul stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. Emily, you're taking this too far. Emily whirled on him, her voice trembling with rage. Too far? You don't get to tell me what's too far, Paul. You destroyed our marriage. Margaret felt her world crumble as she watched her daughter's composure falter, tears finally streaming down her face. I trusted you, Emily said, her voice breaking. Both of you. Margaret reached out, but Emily stepped back, shaking her head. I don't want to hear it, Emily said, her voice hollow. You can pack your things and leave. Margaret nodded numbly, the enormity of what had just happened crashing over her like a tidal wave. As Emily stormed out of the room, Paul sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Margaret stood frozen, clutching the envelope as her entire life unraveled around her. The truth was out, the damage done, and there was no going back.